The knock at midnight came from his boss demanding he say it again. Meredith Lorne stood barefoot in the hallway. Rain threaded down the stairwell. His son was asleep 10 feet away. Her jacket dripped on his floor. She wanted him to repeat what he'd said, but this time while looking directly at her. But the sentence about backfilled freight logs had already claimed a casualty. Raquel Ibarra in Arizona had been filing the same memos for 6 months, documenting the same compliance gaps, and died in a single vehicle accident the week before her scheduled termination. The annotated logs Meredith would bring 18 hours later? They proved Elroy wasn't the first person to see it, he was just the last one willing to say it out loud. Drop a comment where you're watching from and subscribe before your name ends up in a legal file you never signed, because Elroy is about to discover how many people stay silent when telling truth costs everything. The knock was already fading when Elroy Whitcomb opened the door, the hallway light behind the woman blinking like it might die at any second, her voice low and urgent, asking him to repeat what he had just said while she stared straight at his face, not the floor, not the space beside his shoulder, but directly at him, as if the words might only count if they survived eye contact. It was 12:41 a.m. In DeKalb County, Georgia, rain still threading down the concrete stairwell outside, and Elroy realized too late that the sentence he'd spoken hours earlier, quiet, factual, impossible to take back, had followed her across state lines and rest stops, and the kind of silence that makes people drive faster than they should. She was his boss. That part alone made the moment unstable. What made it dangerous was that she hadn't come here to assert authority, or manage perception or smooth over the kind of corporate friction that usually dissolves with distance and time. She had come to test truth, and the testing required proximity, required the elimination of cameras in conference rooms, and the protective architecture of professional distance. Meredith Lorne stood in the threshold of his apartment, regional director for a logistics firm with terminals stretching from Savannah to Spokane, barefoot because her shoes were somewhere near Macon. She would say later, abandoned at a rest stop, where she'd pulled over to read something that couldn't wait until morning. Her jacket was still wet. Her hands weren't shaking, but they weren't still either. Elroy stepped back to let her in, because there was nowhere else for the moment to go. No script for what happens when hierarchy collapses at midnight, and the only thing left between two people is the question of whether a sentence spoken in daylight can survive the weight of being repeated in the dark. The apartment smelled faintly of laundry detergent, and the tomato soup his son had insisted on eating before bed, the kind of domestic texture that made the intrusion feel even stranger, as if two incompatible realities were trying to occupy the same space. Miles was asleep on the pull-out couch in the living room, 11 years old, one sock missing, a paperback novel face down on his chest, his mouthguard sitting on the coffee table where he'd left it after complaining again about the headaches. The woman Meredith noticed him immediately, her gaze moving from the boy to Elroy and back again with something that looked like alarm, though whether it was alarm at the presence of a child or alarm at what his presence implied about the risk she was taking by being here was impossible to say. "I didn't know," she said, and Elroy didn't answer because he knew which version of not knowing she meant. She didn't know he had a son. She didn't know the sentence he'd spoken in that fluorescent conference room off Interstate 285 would require this, would pull her out of her office in Fulton County and onto the highway at a time when reasonable people were either asleep or making decisions they'd have to explain later. She didn't know, and now she did, and the knowing had changed the shape of whatever happened next. Elroy closed the door quietly, careful not to wake Miles, and turned to face her. Meredith was still standing just inside the threshold, not removing her wet jacket, not moving farther into the room, as if committing fully to being here might make the moment irreversible in ways she wasn't ready to accept. The silence between them wasn't heavy exactly, it was precise, the kind of silence that exists when two people are calculating the cost of what comes next and trying to decide if the cost is worth paying. "I need you to say it again," Meredith said, her voice barely louder than the sound of rain still audible through the window. "Not because I didn't hear you, because I need to know if you'll say it while you look at me." 20 hours earlier, in a fluorescent conference room off Interstate 285, Elroy had been asked to confirm a compliance report tied to a cross-dock facility in Lowndes County during the part of the meeting where people were already mentally halfway out the door, laptops closing, the kind of administrative wrap-up that rarely produces disruption. The numbers were clean in the slide deck, signatures intact, timeline tidy. Meredith had been standing near the window scrolling through her phone, and the operations VP from Tucson, Gerard Pruitt, who oversaw freight coordination across the southwestern terminals, had been leaning back in his chair with the practiced ease of someone expecting nothing unusual. Elroy had looked at the slide 3 seconds longer than necessary, not from uncertainty, but because he was deciding whether to say what needed saying in a room where 12 people would hear it, and half would have reasons to pretend they hadn't. He'd pulled the routing data during a freight audit that started in El Paso, Texas, 2 days earlier. The timestamps in the Lowndes County report didn't match the routing data not by minutes or hours, but by days. The kind of discrepancy that doesn't happen by accident when you're moving freight across state lines, under federal oversight and contractual deadlines. He'd said it evenly, without accusation. The shipments had been backfilled, he said. Someone was covering a gap with paperwork, creating the appearance of compliance after the fact. The freight that was supposed to have moved through Lowndes County in late September had either moved through different channels or hadn't moved at all until early October, which meant the documentation everyone was looking at was a reconstruction, not a record. He'd said it clearly enough that no one could claim later they'd misunderstood. And he'd said it while looking at the slide, not at the faces around the table, because that made it easier to treat the information as neutral. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds longer than normal, long enough for Gerard Pruitt from Tucson to glance at his phone, then set it face down on the table, with deliberate care that suggested the gesture meant something Elroy couldn't decode. Meredith had stopped scrolling. She'd looked up, her expression unreadable, in the way people in authority learn to make their faces blank when calculating how much damage a sentence might cause and whether it can be contained. She'd smiled, thanked Elroy for the thoroughness of his work, and asked him to send the files directly to her. The meeting had moved on because meetings like this always move on, the machinery of corporate process designed to absorb disruption and keep grinding forward. Elroy had known, even then, that the sentence had weight, that it would travel beyond the conference room in ways he couldn't predict, and that Meredith's careful neutrality, her smile, her thank you, her request for files was acknowledgement that something irreversible had just occurred, even if no one was willing to name it yet. He'd sent the files that afternoon, certified them through the internal audit system with timestamps and digital signatures that would make it impossible to claim later the information had never been delivered, then went home to make dinner for Miles and help him with homework, pretending nothing about the day had been different even though he'd felt the shift already. The way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives. Elroy repeated the sentence exactly as he'd said it in the conference room, word for word. And this time he didn't lower his eyes or add qualifiers that might have made it easier for her to hear. He said the timestamps didn't match, that the shipments had been backfilled, that someone was covering gaps with paperwork, and he said it while looking directly at her the way she'd asked. The silence that followed was precise, the kind that exists when two people acknowledge something that can't be unacknowledged once spoken in a space this small. Meredith nodded once, then sank onto the edge of the armchair near the window without removing her wet jacket. She sat forward, elbows on her knees, and when she spoke her voice was quieter than in the doorway, stripped of professional authority and replaced with something closer to exhaustion. "I got a memo at 10 tonight," she said, looking at the floor. "Forwarded anonymously to my personal email. Emergency board meeting, 7 a.m., Fulton County. Agenda: address compliance irregularities in Georgia operations, personnel actions, tied to recent audit flags." She looked up. "Your name wasn't in the memo, but it didn't need to be. I know what audit flags they're talking about." Elroy felt the tightness in his chest when a threat you'd been tracking suddenly accelerates. He thought about Miles asleep in the next room. The mouth guard on the table, the insurance coverage that would disappear the moment personnel actions became real. Meredith explained why she couldn't call work phone monitored for anyone at regional director level, personal phone left in her office when she walked out at 10:30. She'd driven from Fulton County to DeKalb County in 30 minutes, because face-to-face was the only way to confirm what she needed before the board met in less than 8 hours. "The expansion into New Jersey and Nevada closes in 6 weeks, she said, voice shifting to calculated clarity. The Arizona terminals were supposed to anchor the Western logistics hub, but there'd been staffing issues last quarter, a supervisor's sudden departure, the details sealed in an HR file I wasn't cleared to access. The board wants growth, wants to show investors the company is scaling efficiently. If your audit slows that timeline, forces a deeper compliance review across multiple terminals, then the expansion gets delayed. Quarterly projections take a hit, and someone has to explain to shareholders why momentum stalled." She paused. "They're not going to admit there were gaps in freight documentation. They're going to say the audit revealed personnel issues that needed immediate correction. Elroy understood what she was offering, not comfort but clarity about the forces positioning themselves to move in his direction. The storm wasn't approaching anymore. It was here, with a timetable. Meredith was watching him carefully, not with detached professionalism but with something close to concern. And he realized she'd driven here not just to test his certainty but to give him a chance to step back before sunrise made the exit disappear. "I need you to be certain," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Not because I doubt you. Because if you're certain, then I have to be certain too, and that changes everything." He was certain. He'd been certain in the conference room when he'd said it the first time, and he was certain now with his son asleep 10 feet away and the machinery of corporate self-preservation already warming up. The numbers didn't lie, the timestamps didn't match, and someone had covered gaps that shouldn't exist. He told her so, quietly, and watched something in her posture shift, not relief, but the kind of settling that happens when a decision finally locks into place. The movement came from the couch, soft but distinct in the quiet apartment, and both Elroy and Meredith turned to find Miles sitting up, hair flattened on one side, the paperback sliding off his chest. He blinked slowly, eyes adjusting to the kitchen light, then looked at the two adults with the confused concern children wear when they wake to find the world rearranged. His mouthguard was still on the coffee table where he'd left it, the clear plastic catching the light. And Elroy felt the familiar weight of worry about the orthodontic surgery his son would need if the misalignment wasn't corrected, the headaches getting worse, the insurance coverage that depended on stability neither could take for granted. Miles didn't ask why there was a stranger in the apartment at 1 a.m. He asked if everything was okay, and the question landed with the directness only children manage. Meredith stood abruptly, apologizing too many times, hands moving to smooth her wet jacket, and Elroy recognized the discomfort that comes when someone realizes they've intruded on something private and human. Miles looked at her, waiting, and when the silence stretched, he asked if she was sad. Meredith stopped apologizing. She looked at him, really looked, then said quietly that she was tired. Miles nodded as if that settled it, and returned to the couch, pulling the blanket up and reaching for his book. The room felt different after that, less strategic, more like what it was. An apartment where a father was trying to raise his son, while systems he'd trusted were deciding whether to punish him for noticing they didn't work fairly. Elroy went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, the small ritual of water boiling and mugs on the counter, a way to reclaim normalcy. The kettle clicked off. He poured water, set 2 mugs down, and felt the moment tilt towards something both risky and human. But Meredith didn't sit. She stayed near the door, jacket damp, and when Elroy turned to hand her the mug, she shook her head. She glanced toward the couch where Miles had settled back into half-sleep, then looked at Elroy with something between resolve and alarm. "I needed to hear it without witnesses," she said again, heavier this time, like she was reminding herself why she'd come. She moved toward the door, and Elroy understood that whatever she did between now and 7 a.m. would happen without him, that his part had been to say the sentence twice and mean it both times, and that the machinery of what came next was already in motion. She left without the tea, without explanation, and the door closed quietly, leaving Elroy with 2 mugs and the awareness that certainty, once confirmed, doesn't pause for convenience. The hallway light was still blinking when he locked the deadbolt. The knock came again 18 hours later. At dusk instead of midnight, the urgency shifted from sharp to something heavier, more deliberate, as if the person on the other side had spent the day calculating whether this second visit was necessary, and had concluded, reluctantly, that it was. Elroy had spent those hours maintaining normalcy, making breakfast for Miles, driving him to school, pretending nothing about the midnight confrontation had disrupted their lives, but the pretending required conscious effort that left him exhausted by the time evening arrived. When he heard the knock, he knew without needing to check that the machinery had already moved through its first cycle and was coming back around with information he wouldn't want to hear. Meredith looked different in the fading daylight than she had under the blinking hallway bulb. Smaller, less contained, carrying a manila envelope against her chest the way people hold things they're not sure they should be delivering. She stepped inside without apologizing this time, set the envelope on the kitchen counter with the kind of careful precision that suggested she'd been thinking about that gesture all day, then faced him with an expression that mixed exhaustion with something closer to defeat. "You weren't the first," she said, and those 5 words reconfigured everything he thought he understood about the position he was standing in. The envelope was postmarked Pinal County, Arizona, dated 3 weeks earlier. Meredith's name handwritten on the front in deliberate script that suggested someone had taken time to make sure every letter was legible. Inside were copies of the same freight logs Elroy had flagged in his audit, but these copies had been annotated months earlier by someone else. The margins tight with notes in blue ink, tracking the same discrepancies he'd found between Lowndes County documentation and El Paso routing data. Questions circled, patterns underlined. At the bottom of the third page, someone had written a single sentence in capital letters, backfill pattern consistent across Q. 3 Southwest operations. Elroy read it twice, then looked up with the kind of disorientation that comes when you realize the story you thought you were in has been running parallel to another story you never knew existed, one that already had casualties. Meredith told him the envelope had been mailed from Yuma, Arizona, where a line supervisor named Raquel Ibarra had died the week before in a single vehicle accident on a stretch of highway outside the city limits, the kind of accident that gets reported as driver error and closed without further investigation. Raquel had been filing internal memos for 6 months, flagging the same compliance gaps Elroy had identified, documenting the same timestamp discrepancies that should have triggered audits but somehow never made it past regional oversight. The memos had been logged internally but never escalated, never reviewed by anyone with authority to force corrective action. Someone mailed this after she died, Meredith said quietly. No return address. Just these logs with her annotations and a printout showing her termination scheduled for the week after the accident. Performance issues that aren't specified anywhere. Her hands stayed flat on the counter. You weren't the first person to see this, Elroy. You were the last person willing to say it out loud where it couldn't be ignored. The room felt colder, and Elroy looked at the annotated logs, understanding that his sentence in the conference room hadn't been discovery. It had been confirmation of something that had already claimed at least one casualty. He thought about Raquel filing memos no one read, documenting patterns no one escalated, and wondered if she'd known her persistence would cost her the job, if she'd calculated the risk and decided it was worth it anyway. Miles called from the living room asking about dinner, and the ordinary question broke through the wait. Meredith picked up the envelope, then set it back down. They're going to move fast now, she said. The board had met that morning. Decisions had been made. The expansion timeline was being protected, and protection required that disruptions be addressed quickly and quietly. The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by courier between school drop-off and when Elroy usually checked his email, the timing calculated. The language was careful, lawyer refined, administrative leave pending routine review of audit protocols, effective immediately, full pay maintained during review, badge access suspended as standard procedure, return company equipment by Friday. No mention of the conference room, or the sentence, or Lowndes County. No acknowledgement that this routine review had been triggered by anything other than the company's commitment to operational excellence. Elroy read it twice, set it beside the Arizona logs, and felt the machinery finally arrive at his address. The consequences moved the way freight moves: indirect, contractual, deniable, each piece traveling through systems designed to obscure causation. His badge went quiet in Gwinnett County, the magnetic strip no longer triggering the locks that had opened automatically for 4 years. When he called the facilities desk to ask if there was an error, they told him, with professional courtesy that felt rehearsed, that his access status was being updated and he should check back next week. A recruiter in Franklin, Tennessee, canceled a call without explanation, the kind of cancellation that arrives via automated email at 7 in the morning, as if an algorithm had decided overnight, rather than a person who'd been enthusiastic about his resume 48 hours earlier. A background check in Harris County, Texas, came back marked inconclusive, not a rejection exactly, but not clearance either, and the hiring manager who'd called him a strong candidate stopped returning his follow-up messages. The insurance notification arrived the same day Meredith stopped answering his calls. Coverage status: suspended pending employment review, effective immediately. Reinstatement contingent upon resolution of administrative status. Elroy stared at the screen, thinking about Miles's mouthguard, the orthodontic consultation scheduled for next month in Gwinnett County, the surgery that would cost $12,000 to $15,000 without insurance, the chronic headaches getting worse because an 11-year-old's jaw was developing wrong, and the correction window was narrowing. He closed the laptop slowly and understood that the punishment wasn't about firing him, it was about suffocation, about making the cost of maintaining integrity too high to bear. Miles asked that night why they were eating soup again, not with accusation but with the observation children make when patterns shift. Elroy told him they were saving money, which was true but incomplete. Miles nodded and ate without asking why saving money had become necessary in a household where it hadn't been discussed 2 weeks earlier. Later, Elroy scrolled through unanswered texts to Meredith, each carefully worded to avoid sounding desperate, each received and read, but never answered. The silence wasn't surprising. Her position had become untenable the moment the board moved, but it landed with weight anyway, the kind that comes when solidarity has limits determined by factors having nothing to do with who's right. The realization settled gradually. The punishment wasn't personal. It was systemic, the kind of response large institutions deploy when they need to make someone disappear without the mess of formal termination or wrongful dismissal claims. No one had accused him of anything. No one had challenged his findings or questioned his methods. They had simply removed the infrastructure that allowed him to function: the badge, the insurance, the professional network, and waited for the pressure to do what pressure does when applied consistently without relief. He looked at the letter, the suspended coverage notice, the soup pot in the sink, and understood that the machinery had been designed for exactly this: to make truth too expensive to speak, to make integrity too costly to maintain, to make people choose between principle and survival, until choosing principle started to feel like choosing failure. The second letter arrived not from the company but from a county clerk in Cochise County, Arizona, and the envelope sat on the counter for 2 hours before Elroy opened it because the Arizona return address didn't fit the pattern he'd been tracking. When he finally slid it open, Miles working on math homework behind him, the letterhead made his chest tighten: County of Cochise, Office of the Clerk of the Superior Court. Civil case number, plaintiff name, defendant entities. Buried in the third paragraph, notification that his name appeared as a corroborating witness in a sealed deposition tied to a wrongful death claim filed on behalf of Raquel Ibarra's estate. He read it 3 times, searching for the moment he'd agreed to this, the conversation or form he'd forgotten signing, but the moment didn't exist. He hadn't testified. He hadn't been contacted by any attorney. He hadn't received a subpoena or request for documents. What he had done was file an audit report, submit freight documentation to his supervisor, and speak a sentence in a conference room off Interstate 285. Someone had taken that work and used it to anchor a case that had been in motion for months while he sat in DeKalb County, believing he was navigating straightforward corporate accountability. The letter continued in legal procedure language. His deposition testimony would remain sealed pending litigation, but his identity as material witness had been disclosed to all parties as required by discovery protocols, meaning the company now knew he wasn't just an internal problem but a liability embedded in litigation that could cost them more than the delayed expansion. The letter thanked him for cooperation he hadn't provided, and reminded him that failure to respond to future subpoenas could result in contempt charges. He set the letter beside the administrative leave notice and Meredith's Arizona envelope, and felt the story he thought he was in collapse sideways. He'd never been the lone analyst making a discovery, but the last visible piece in a pattern forming for months in courtrooms and depositions he'd never known existed. Subscribe before your name ends up in a legal file you never signed, because in systems like this, silence isn't protection, and participation isn't always voluntary. His phone buzzed. Meredith, first contact in 5 days. Her voice came through quieter, stripped of authority, closer to strategy than solidarity. She asked if he'd received anything from Arizona. When he said yes, she was silent for 3 seconds too long, someone recalculating. The company's legal team had been notified that morning. The board was convening emergency session to assess exposure. His administrative review was being expedited because having him in limbo while litigation was active created complications no one had planned for. They're offering reinstatement, she said, and Elroy heard how she'd positioned the offer as coming from them, not her messenger, not architect. Full back pay, position restored, insurance reinstated immediately, but there's a non-disclosure agreement. You'd be committing not to discuss the audit findings, the Arizona situation, or any related matters with outside parties, including attorneys, including journalists, including anyone involved in active litigation. He looked at the Cochise County letter, at the line about his identity disclosed to all parties, and understood the NDA wasn't being offered to protect the company from him, it was to protect them from what he'd already, unknowingly, set in motion. The wrongful death case was proceeding with or without him. The sealed deposition had his audit files embedded. The expansion timeline was already compromised by litigation the board couldn't make disappear. What they needed now wasn't his silence going forward. What they needed was his commitment not to add anything else to a case that had been building around him while he'd focused on whether his badge would work and whether Miles would get surgery before the correction window closed. Meredith was still on the line, waiting, and Elroy realized this wasn't the relief she'd driven to his apartment at midnight hoping to create. This was the containment strategy that gets deployed when relief isn't possible. and the best option left is limiting how much damage truth can do before someone finds a way to settle it into silence. Meredith was still waiting on the line, and Elroy could hear background noise that sounded like traffic or ventilation, someone calling from a car between official duties. The offer was clear: reinstatement, back pay, insurance coverage lived the moment he signed, which meant Miles's orthodontic consultation could proceed as scheduled, and the surgery to correct the jaw misalignment and stop the headaches could happen within the narrowing correction window. $12,000 to $15,000 would become a covered procedure instead of an impossible expense. The badge would work in Gwinnett County. The recruiter in Franklin would return calls. The background check in Harris County would clear. Everything systematically dismantled would reassemble, requiring only his signature on a document promising not to discuss what he'd found or what had happened to the woman in Arizona who'd found it first. He looked across the kitchen at Miles, still bent over math homework, but pencils stopped moving, and understood his son was listening the way children listen when pretending not to, absorbing adult conversations' contours even when specific words don't make sense yet. Miles had already asked why they were eating soup again, already noticed the apartment's atmosphere had changed, that his father spent more time on worried phone calls, that their life's rhythms had shifted. The mouthguard was still on the coffee table. The consultation reminder was pinned to the refrigerator. Miles had asked about it twice this week, each time with the careful neutrality children use when testing whether it's safe to ask questions about things adults seem stressed about. Elroy could take the offer, sign the NDA, watch the insurance update, schedule the consultation, tell Miles everything was fine, go back to work with his badge reactivated and audit files sealed behind legal protections that would make them invisible. The Arizona wrongful death case would proceed without him adding to it, handled by attorneys who already had the sealed deposition containing his work. Raquel Ibarra was already dead. The freight logs were already annotated. The backfilling pattern was already documented. But Miles was listening from across the kitchen, and Elroy thought about Raquel filing memos no one read, persisting with methodical attention, suggesting she'd believed the system would eventually respond. He thought about the envelope mailed anonymously after her death by someone who decided making the pattern visible mattered despite the costs. He thought about the sentence he'd spoken because it was true, and because speaking truth in rooms where decisions get made was supposed to be how systems claiming accountability actually maintained it. And he thought about Miles growing up learning that integrity survives only when it doesn't cost anything, that principle matters only until it conflicts with insurance coverage, that telling truth is valuable until the system asks you to be quiet and offers enough compensation to make quiet feel reasonable. No, Elroy said, quieter than intended but clear enough that Meredith heard it through the phone, and Miles heard it across the kitchen. Not a speech, not a declaration. Just a single syllable that meant he wasn't signing, wasn't accepting the offer that would have made everything easier, except for the part where it would have made everything worse in ways that wouldn't show up on an insurance claim or back pay calculation. Meredith didn't argue. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted to something closer to resignation, or respect, or exhaustion, with a situation that had stopped offering good options. "I understand," she said. Then, after another pause, "I wish I'd understood earlier." The line went silent. Miles looked up from his homework, pencil still not moving, and met his father's eyes with the directness children use when they know something important just happened. Elroy expected a question about the call, the insurance, what no meant. But Miles didn't ask. He just held his father's gaze for a moment, then went back to his math, and Elroy understood his son had heard enough to know that a choice had been made, that the choice had costs, and that the costs were ones they'd be carrying forward together into whatever came next. The call came from a journalist 2 days later, area code King County, Washington, the same region where the company's Pacific Northwest expansion was supposed to anchor the logistics network. Elroy didn't answer. He let it go to voicemail while washing breakfast dishes, and when he listened an hour later standing in the post office parking lot in DeKalb County, the journalist's voice was professional and measured. "Mr. Whitcomb, my name is Sarah Chen. I'm investigating a pattern of safety violations and workforce retaliation across freight terminals in the Pacific Northwest. Your name came up in sealed depositions related to compliance irregularities in multiple states. I'd like to talk." She left a callback number. Elroy didn't write it down. He walked into the post office to mail the files, every document, every annotation, every timestamp that didn't match, certified and addressed to the Cochise County clerk, and when he came back out 15 minutes later, there was a dark sedan parked across the street that hadn't been there before. The driver sat behind the wheel, hands visible on the steering wheel, not reading a phone, not drinking coffee, just sitting with a deliberateness that felt wrong. Elroy looked at the car for 3 seconds. The driver noticed. The sedan pulled away without hurry, merging into traffic and disappearing before Elroy could decide whether he was seeing surveillance or paranoia taking shape in an empty parking lot. The question came that evening while they were building the desk Elroy had bought secondhand, the kind of flat-pack project that gives you something to do with your hands while your mind processes things you haven't figured out how to talk about. Miles was holding the side panel steady while Elroy tightened screws, and the question arrived without preamble. "Are we moving?" Miles asked, and Elroy's hand slipped on the screwdriver, the tip skating across wood and leaving a mark. He asked why Miles was asking. Miles said a kid in his class. His dad lost his job and they moved to Alabama to live with grandparents, and now the kid wasn't in school anymore. Elroy told him they weren't moving. Miles nodded, the kind that means, "I heard what you said, not I believe what you said," and they finished the desk in heavier silence. Later, after Miles had gone to bed, Elroy sat at the new desk, trying to organize the fragments of what had happened into something that looked like a plan. But the fragments refused to organize themselves into anything except evidence that the system dismantling his life had more moving parts than he'd accounted for. The phone rang at 3 in the morning, vibration loud enough to wake him from exhausted half-sleep. Unknown number. He let it ring through to voicemail, then watched the screen light up again 30 seconds later. Same number. This time he answered without speaking. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that he thought it might be a wrong number. Then there was a click, followed by the dial tone. Whoever had called had hung up deliberately. He set the phone down and lay awake until dawn, trying to decide whether the call meant something or whether exhaustion was turning ordinary noise into signals that weren't there. If you believe that quiet refusals matter, that integrity survives only when someone bears witness, then subscribe, because what happens when the system stops asking and starts demanding is something every working person should see coming. The knock came at 7:30 the next morning, earlier this time, and Elroy knew before he opened the door that it wasn't Meredith returning. The man at the door was younger than Elroy expected, wearing a messenger bag and holding a tablet already queued to the signature screen. Process server. He asked if Elroy was Elroy Whitcomb. When Elroy said yes, the man handed him an envelope with the seal of the United States District Court for the District of New Jersey embossed across the front, then held out the tablet. Elroy signed with his finger, a scrawl that satisfied whatever verification the tablet was running, and the man thanked him with professional courtesy that suggested he did this dozens of times a week. The envelope was heavier than the Cochise County one, thick government stock designed to feel official. Elroy opened it standing in the doorway, morning air cold enough to see his breath. Subpoena to testify. United States District Court, District of New Jersey. Civil action consolidated under multiple case numbers. This wasn't just about the Arizona wrongful death claim anymore, but something larger, pulling together complaints and depositions from terminals across enough states that federal court had decided it needed single proceeding handling. The date was circled in red ink, February 18th, 42 days from now, 9 a.m., Federal Courthouse in Newark. Elroy looked past the paperwork to where Miles sat at the kitchen table eating cereal, still in pajamas, television playing cartoons at low volume. His son glanced up, saw his father in the doorway with papers in hand, and the look between them lasted only a second but carried the weight of every conversation they'd had and hadn't had over the past month, every question about soup and moving and doctor appointments, every silence that had stretched too long. His phone buzzed. Meredith's name, first time in a week. They're moving fast. 3 words, no context, and Elroy understood she was telling him something she thought he needed to know, even if it put her in a position she'd been avoiding. The case was accelerating, the timeline compressed. Whatever the company hoped to settle quietly was now going to federal court with witnesses and evidence that couldn't be sealed or made to disappear through NDAs signed under pressure. He closed the door and set the subpoena on the counter next to the administrative leave letter, the Cochise County notification, the Arizona logs paper tracking the path from a sentence spoken in a conference room off Interstate 285 to a federal courthouse in Newark, where that sentence would be repeated under oath. Miles was still eating cereal, still watching cartoons, and Elroy felt the choice settle into place with the weight of a freight car locking onto rails. The kind of connection that doesn't happen by accident but through deliberate alignment of forces building momentum longer than anyone realized, until the moment of impact arrived. The camera doesn't cut away here. It holds on the kitchen, on the father looking at documents that will require him to speak under penalty of perjury, on the son who understands enough to know that whatever his father decides, will determine what kind of world they're living in and what kinds of choices are possible when systems fail. The subpoena has a date. The oath has weight. The next sentence Elroy speaks in a room where decisions get made will be recorded and used as evidence in a case already larger than he understood when he flagged the Lowndes County discrepancies. The morning light comes through the window. Miles finishes his cereal. The television plays cartoons. Neither of them are watching. And the question the camera holds on, the question that matters more than any answer, is what Elroy will say when he sits in that Newark courthouse and someone asks him to confirm, under oath. While he looks at them, whether the timestamps matched, or whether someone covered the gaps, or whether the truth he spoke once in Georgia still counts when speaking it again, costs everything he's been trying to protect.